So, I don't know about you, but during lockdown, I seem to spend most of my day joining Zoom meetings. And each time I have to join a new meeting, you have to open your Google Calendar, open the meeting, click the launch Zoom button, and then wait for that to open in your browser, and then open the client. And as a software engineer, these repeatable clicks drive me crazy. So I thought that it might be fun to build a command line tool which would find my current meeting and just open it for me. And I also thought it might be fun to share that with all of you. So I'm going to film and record that as I go along. So what we're going to do is integrate with the Google Calendar API to look up the current meeting, and then open the Zoom link in that meeting in the invite, and open that locally so that I don't have to go through those annoying clicks in order to open every single meeting. So it should be pretty fun. Working with the Google Calendar API should be interesting. And I'm going to write the whole thing in Go and implement it as a command line tool. This is my first ever Golang recorded project, so please let me know what you think down in the comments. If you have any questions as we go along, make sure to ask those down in the comments too, and I'll get back to all of those. And leave a thumbs up if you're interested in seeing more Golang projects just like this one. So let's get started. Okay, so I started off by making this test calendar. We can use this to create events in the calendar to test with. For example, I've installed Zoom, so you can see I can add a Zoom meeting, so you can use that to test shortly. I'm about 50% confident this is going to work. I haven't yet looked at the Google Calendar API, so I'm not 100% sure that API will actually give us the Zoom link. If it doesn't, then instead we'll have to use Google Hangouts or it's Google Meet. I'm more confident that the API will give us the Google Meet link. So if the Zoom meeting link isn't available, we'll pivot and use Google Meet instead. But like I say, I haven't actually checked the Google Calendar API. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. So search for Google Calendar. I'm sure there'll be. I'm sure there'll be. So this is. Here we go. Yeah, so I'm expecting there's going to be some package which will make this very easy for us, where we just pass in. Yeah, there we go. So we pass in some OAuth config. Okay. So this sample code here is giving us a way to create a client for calling the Google Calendar API. So we need to install a few things. We need to install the API. So the Calendar API client. What else? Okay, this is pretty straightforward. So this sample code is for creating a token, for reading it, so saving it and then reading it from a file, so we don't have to fetch it every time. And what is this OAuth config? How are we populating that? When we call get client, we've got to pass in this OAuth config. So I want to see how what we're passing in there. Google from config, calendar read only scope, credentials JSON. Okay, so if you haven't got the token, you'll use this credentials. Okay, so preferably we can pre-populate the token rather than having to fetch it every time. And it's saying, okay, so if the scope's changed, you need to delete your token, which is fine. but we won't need to, so we should be able to get a token and use it essentially forever. So the first thing we want to do is get a token. So step 1, turn on the Google Calendar API. Click this button. Download client configuration. Okay. So the first thing is, let's call this Zoom meeting client, Zoom CLI. Okay. So hopefully this is going to give us credentials and then we'll be able to fetch the token from that. So what's this? Configure your OAuth clients. Not really sure what impact this is going to have. Let's call it a desktop app. Okay, so step 1 complete. We've now downloaded the credentials. Okay, so our next step is to start our Go project and install these dependencies. So I've created this new empty folder in which we'll create our Go project. So the first thing we ought to do is init the Go module. Let's call it attend G meeting, and then we can start Go getting these things. So first, this is the client for the calendar API. We'll install that. Well, let's do now. I'll copy and paste this one too. And then we need the OAuth client, which we use to generate a token from our credentials. A lot of dependencies here. Okay, great. Let's run this. Perfect. So we should be done now with installing dependencies. The other thing that I want to do, get the credentials that we've just installed and copy them. So we'll copy them in here. It means we have these credentials JSON. Just easier for when we're working with that credentials JSON shortly. Now we need to remember not to commit that. So I'm going to create a new. I'm going to create a git ignore. And this will be our first line. So now we have our git ignore, and it's going to block this. It's going to block us from pushing the credentials JSON. So if we take a look, we see that credentials JSON doesn't show up in the git status. It's important because these credentials are sensitive. You don't want other people getting access to your Google Calendar. So make sure not to commit your credentials to GitHub. Okay, so with that done, we can start thinking about implementing this. So I'm going to be using VS Code. I usually use Golang for Go projects, but not going to today just because I need to actually renew my license. It ran out a couple of days ago. I haven't gotten around to renewing it yet, but usually I do use Golang. I much prefer it over VS Code just for Go programming. For everything else, VS Code is great, but I find when you're using Go modules, especially if you're vendoring them, which we often have to do at my work, VS Code absolutely breaks down. Autocomplete can take, well, it can basically just stop working. So Golang is a much better alternative when you're working on larger Go repos. But for this project, VS Code should do everything we need to do. So let's get started. So if we revert back to looking at the docs for a minute, and let's just reorder things here. If we go back to looking at the docs for a second, where we've obviously installed our dependencies, now we need to set up all of this. So we'll recall that we need to fetch our token. At least initially, we're not going to have a token. Once we've got that, just like they do in this example, we can cache the token so we don't have to keep refetching it. Let's start with that. Let's first of all create. Let's say gcal.go, and we'll call this. What did I call the module? Attend G meeting. Okay. So for our Google Calendar client, we really only need a method which is going to pick get either say the current meeting or the upcoming meeting. So I'm not exactly sure how the Google Calendar API is going to let us do that. Say filter by time. So let's leave the let's say call it get upcoming meeting, and we might have to change that. I don't know anything about the types for this for now. What we do need is a Google Calendar client. Let's say new gcal client, and that's going to have to retrieve a token, which can either which will either be get stash token if there is one, else get new token. So let's start off by implementing these methods. So we also need a method which will stash token, just so that we can save a token should we have fetched it. Now the get stash token, well, I'm assuming that these tokens are going to be a string, and it will also return an error. Stash token only needs to return an error, and it will take our token, which is again assumed to be a string. Might not be, but let's see. Same here. Let's so this is going to call the web, but for now, let's write a constant. This is where we'll for saving our token. So let's save it in temporary directory, which should be fine. And we'll call this gcal token. And we'll say token stash. So what this means, we'll always store the token here, and that may as well be a constant. So get stash token, we can just use, it's a very short file, so we don't need to worry about buffering the file or anything like that. We can just try reading token stash and get a token bytes back or an error. So if the error is nil, then we can just return that error. We don't really need to worry about handling this because all errors will be handled the same in the layer above, like you'll see shortly. Simply, if we fail to get a local token, we'll just try and get a new token. So if however we get no error, then let's return, well, what we should say is if the length of the token is, what should we say? If the length of the token is 0, that also should count as a failure because it means that the file exists but is empty for whatever reason. Perhaps it was modified by some other program. So let's say we'll return an error, token file empty, something like that. Again, it doesn't actually matter because all errors will be handled the same by the layer above. Finally, we'll return string and nil. So all this is doing is reading the file. If there's an error reading the file or retrieving the token, we return that error. Otherwise, we return it as a string. So that now in the layer above, we can call this stash token error equals get stash token. If error is not equal to nil, we can try to get new token. And here again, we're going to return the string and error. Otherwise, we'll return stash token nil. Okay, so that's all pretty simple. Let's quickly implement stash token. So we take the token and we'll return util.writeFile. We want to write it to token stash. We want to write the bytes which are of the token, so just convert this string to bytes. And the permission is the read-write permission, which from the top of my head is 0644. There probably is a constant for this, but I know the number rather than the constant. So now onto the bit that we don't know how to do, which is how to fetch this new token. So this is where we will end up the first time we use this CLI, and certainly whenever we say restart the computer and the stash is deleted, the temporary directory is removed. So for debug purposes, let's add a log here saying fetching new token. Now, if we wanted this to be a production system, we might have a flag around, use something like the log library and hide these logs unless we were in, say, debug mode. We can do that at a later date, but for now, it's just handy to have the logs. And now, so we've done this, reading from the file. And the same, we've just implemented this in a slightly more simple way. Again, we used IOUtil to avoid a lot of this complexity with the operating system package. But what we do need is the way to get this new token from the web. So the auth URL equals config URL. Okay, so this config is what? Sorry, this config is this old config. Okay, yeah, so we haven't got this parameter in our new gcal here. Nice thing about VS Code, of course, it also imports that for us. And we're going to be returning our HTTP clients. So I better add that in as well. Now, I can't remember what the answer, I asked this before. What are we passing in here when we're calling new clients? So we can generate this config by passing in, so we read the credentials. Okay, so we can read the credentials file first. So let's say credentials path equals credentials.json. It's in the same directory, so that's cool. So when we're going to generate our new client, actually, do we want? I'm going to do this inside here. Actually, the new gcal client would be the function which is most aware of the credentials. So let's say we'll get credentials bytes error is ioutil dot read file, and we just want to read the credentials path. What's this error for? Pluralize that. We ought to return an error here too, and we can say nil, return nil. Okay, so we read the credentials. Now we need to generate this config here. So we pass in, I'm going to copy this because it's meaningless to me. So this Google package is what here? Okay, so we need the OAuth import that. That allows us to generate this config. We're going to pass in the credentials here. Okay, and it's also imported this calendar v3, which I think is correct. Perfect. So that generates our config. Again, if as with Go, you end up writing if return nil, return 20 times per file. It's a shame that there's not a better solution to this in Go, but it's nice that that by default errors are returned rather than thrown like in something like JavaScript. Okay, cool. So we've generated our config, which means that now we are up to this point here. So token from file, okay, we've done that. Okay. So now when we call get token, we need to pass in this config. So the config is of this type, so let's pass it in. Okay, hopefully that's imported. Auth, perfect. Yeah, so here let's try and get our token. To do that, we need to give it this OAuth config we've just created, or Google's creating for us. And down here, we need to pass that into our get new token function, which is here. And this is when we need to, where we've gotten to, so we need to actually implement this. So we need to generate the auth URL, which again, the Google package is just going to do for us. Auth code, just this method on the config, which is fine. I'm guessing that the state token is just the kind of token that we need for this. And this is the kind of access that we need. Okay, so we've done that. We're reading in an authorization code. I'm not sure about this. Okay. So when we generate a new token, we actually the user has to get this from their browser. So I'm just going to copy this log because it's pretty handy. We're not fetching a token. I thought we would be generating one like a bearer token, but it seems not. Instead, we have to. So auth URL is a string. Okay. One other thing I do want to do for debug purposes is if we get an error here, I just want to log that error. Printf error getting stashed token. Just in case we have a bug there that we don't notice. We want to see what the error is before fetching this new token. Okay, so we'll go to the link URL. That's going to give us the token, which we're then going to read in. So we can just read in with fmt.scan. It's just going to take in from the CLI a code, a text entered by the user. So let's swap this for, I don't really use the log package that much. So let's actually use error F. I'm able to read that, perfect. Let's return. Okay, return the error if we're unable to get that. Okay, so then we do this config exchange. So just another method on the config. Okay, we need context. Yeah, I'm not sure what the to-do context is. There's a non-nil empty context. Okay, yeah, fine. I never use that. I always use background, but so we get our token. So if there's an error while retrieving the token, let's return that error. Again, I'm going to add some context to it because that might not be clear coming out of that function. Unable to exchange. We're exchanging auth code for token, and we'll print our error. Otherwise, we can just return our token, which is okay. Right, yes. So it's probably the token probably has a type, and where we actually use that token getting from web. Right, and then we actually pass it into the client. So it's not a string. So I can go through and change all of these. I'll have to change these returns as well. So how does we probably need to, when we get stash token, we probably need to marshal and unmarshal that rather than obviously just saving it as a string. So let's pass those in and then we'll fix this shortly. Yep, so we'll fix that. And then, okay, so I'll come back and fix those in a second. But we need to return one of these. So yeah, I was assuming it's a string, but it's not. So we need to return empty structs like that. Finally, yeah, we need to marshal this here. I'm almost certain that we can marshal and unmarshal it. So we want to get our stash token. So we'll token here, and then we can just JSON.unmarshal this from token. So we're going to unmarshal the bytes into our token here, and then we can just return the token. Well, we can return points to the token. Okay, so now we need to do the reverse when we stash this token. So obviously we need to marshal it. So marshal it into bytes so we can save it in a file. So let's JSON.marshal our token. Obviously, if we get an error here, we need to return that. Otherwise, we already have our bytes and we can just write those to a file. I think that should work. We'll have to check that marshalling is being done correctly. Otherwise, we should be good. So what does that leave us? Okay, so as far as I can tell, that leaves us with a token of this OAuth Google type, which now we can just pass in to create a new client here. So let's generate one. Client equals, what was the method here? Config.client, and it takes a new context, so let's give it a background context, and it takes in our token, which we have, and it returns a client. So let's return a client nil, but we also do need to actually handle this. But that looks good to me. So let's walk through the steps again. So in order to get this Google Calendar client, which is going to fetch our meetings for us, we first read the credentials from the file that we downloaded earlier from Google. We have used that to generate this OAuth config, which will allow us to then generate a token and eventually a client. We've retrieved our token first by trying to retrieve one which is stashed. If we haven't got one which is stashed, then we fetch one from the web. As we've just been through, the way that works is by the user going to a generated URL, getting an authorization code, which we can then pass back and exchange for a token here. That should eventually give us a token from the web, and one way or another give us a token. So once we've got that token, we should be able to then just use it to get a client here. So I'd say we should probably test that now. So if we just generate this client, client error equals new gcal client. We don't need to pass anything in here. And then all we need to do, let's just print so we don't get any errors. Let's print our error. And we probably can also just print something about the client so that we don't get an error there either. Well, actually, no, we don't need to. We can just not use that variable for now. Then if we just create a main function, I've forgotten what the package was called, func main, we call this. Just check in here to see if we get any errors. What's it complaining about? Might be missing something here. Let's try building and see if we can. No, it looks good. So let's go run star.go and see what happens. We do need to. I can never remember the rules around Go when creating, say, like usable libraries versus or packages versus binaries, but yeah, you do need to name the package main. So, and right, let's try that again. Let's just build. We're good to build. I don't know why I'm building before running. It makes no difference. You can see it's given us our URL. Okay, so I went to this URL. It made me sign into my Google account, just as you'd expect. Now, Google hasn't authorized my app yet, so it tells the user when you go to this URL that it's unsafe, which is fine. I trust myself. So you're able to continue through that anyway, and it gives you a token. I pasted the token in, and as you can see now, it gives us an error nil, which suggests that we got a successfully built client, which is great. Before we move on, one other thing we need to do is make sure that we successfully stashed our token. So if we cat this, you know what we didn't do? I think we actually forgot to stash our token. So didn't we use this anywhere? No. So I actually forgot to stash this token. So let's let's remember to do that. So if is not equal nil, return token error. Otherwise, we want to stash the token and then return token nil. Now, stash token does actually return an error, but if it doesn't succeed and write into the file, that's actually okay. We'll just get away with it. Next time we'll try again, basically. Okay, so now that should work. Let's run this again. Okay, so I've just repeated the steps I took last time, rerunning this, and this time with that change so that we stashed the token. And let me reorder these because this is an annoying order here. And now, if we cap that, we can see that we actually have a token, which is great. Okay, so I think I'm gonna cut part one there. We've got the Google Calendar client working now. So in part two, which will come out tomorrow, what we'll do is start using this calendar client to do something interesting. We'll start to query for meetings and then open the Zoom links, hopefully, and get those to open automatically using the CLI tool. So stay tuned for part two. Make sure to subscribe and perhaps turn on notifications so that you don't miss the second part of this. Also, like I said, leave a comment down below with any thoughts or questions you have. I'll be sure to respond to all of those. And give this a thumbs up if you enjoy the code along format, basically. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for part two.